Sangsara Pranaya Karina Ghana Ghanatyam Sapta Sakalana Gunarnavasha Bandi. This is the resurrection of Krishna culture in its homeland, right? There was one additional step that had to happen, and in plotting out the trajectory of Swami in a Strange Land, I end with this court case. In 1977, charges were brought against the International Society for Krishna Consciousness on brainwashing. The charges were that young people coming to devotee life were essentially being brainwashed into giving up their material goods and chanting the same thing every day and becoming vegetarian, my God, and all of these other strange behavior patterns. And the court case took place just months before Srila Prabhupada passed away. And there was discussion, how should we do this? Should we go into court wearing, a suit and tie? And Prabhupada said, no. You go in, shaved head, robes, and you bring in all of my books. You bring all of my books, and the court has to read all my books. This is the law. You have to read our arguments, and then you decide. So Adi Keshava, who was at that time one of the co-defendants in the case, came in, full regalia, with a cart, wheeling all of Prabhupada's books. And of course there had been a campaign to solicit endorsements and letters of support from the academic community, from leading Indian industrialists and ranking members of society. And when all of this evidence was laid before the New York State Supreme Court Justice, he came back with a verdict that Krishna consciousness is a bona fide religion with its roots going back thousands of years in Indian culture. And these people have the constitutional right to follow the faith of their choosing and must be allowed to do so. And that this nation stands on its freedom of religion, and that freedom must not be abrogated simply because a culture looks strange to us. Very wise judgment on the part of the court. Of course, the irony in this is that Prabhupada insisted Krishna consciousness is not a religion. But he knew that this would be an important landmark. So it was brought to him, and Tamal Krishna held the newspaper up, and he read the article. And Prabhupada, this was weeks before Prabhupada passed away, he sat back and he said, my mission is now accomplished. He had done what he was allowed to do. So of course, under the monomythic category of bringing that boon, that light of truth back into the world, includes through his disciples. In other words, his passing was not the end, but actually just the beginning of the boon. We see it in the work of the GBC, in establishing systems and protocols and guidelines that will assure the integrity of Prabhupada's institutions. We see it in the work of Shonak Rishi at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, which has been absolutely revolutionary in reversing all of those misunderstandings that had been promulgated by the British historians and missionaries for the last 300 years. The Oxford Center, with the help of a beautiful coterie of world scholars, now has a PhD program, and we have devotee PhDs who are themselves becoming the authorities in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. We saw it in the work of our late dear godbrother Bhakti Tirtha Swami, who dedicated his energies to the well-being of the African and African American communities. We see it in the work of Radhanath Swami's Eco-Village outside Mumbai. We see now our first congresswoman, Tulsi Gabbard, who was raised in a devotee family, now a member of Congress. In the work of the late Sadhaputta Prabhu, whom you see on the right here, and the other devotee scientists from the Bhaktivedanta Institute, who worked diligently to establish this extraordinary meeting of the world of scientific research and consciousness research. This is an absolutely volcanic change, a sea change, a game changer in the history of human culture since the Enlightenment. That finally this notion that somehow religion is anti-science and that science is anti-religion is being rectified, and the points of tangency between what our deepest impulses intellectually tell us and our deepest impulses spiritually tell us, there is a point of convergence between those two. Wonderful, wonderful change. We see it in the work of the midday meals, which is now up to more than 1 million plates of hot, nutritious prasadam being distributed in India every day. If you haven't been to see the midday meals program in India, it is breathtaking. From, I think, 7 locations around in India, these huge vats make fresh khichdi, and each day it's a different kind. There's different vegetables. It's not the same dish every day. And these things have to be packaged under extremely sanitary condition, driven by customized vans to the schools, because you only have a half hour in which to deliver fresh cooked meals in the Indian school systems. So you have 1 million indigent school children receiving hot, nutritious vegetarian meals every day thanks to these efforts going on. We see it, of course, in the Sankirtan movement that's on the rise, a renaissance of the street chanting. Here you see pictures from Paris and Moscow. We see it there, of course, also in the Kirtan culture, where some of our God brothers and God sisters are becoming leading voices in this new category of music, which is, of course, owes its origins to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's Sankirtan parties. We also see Prabhupada's mission perpetuated and expanding into society in the yoga culture. A lot of our devotees are now also very esteemed yoga instructors. And we see it, of course, in the work of the Mayapur project, which is an absolutely amazing ninth wonder of the world. And if you have not been there, I encourage you all to see it. It's scheduled to open in 2022. It is the second largest dome in history. It's the largest single religious structure in India. It's you know, you drive north from Calcutta about 4 hours, right? And cities give way to countries, give way to dirt roads. The dirt roads to tiny little rutted paths. And then you come into the Mayapur district and you're driving down streets better fashioned for bullock carts than cars. And then you turn a corner and you look up, and like the mother of all UFOs, you know, has just descended on these rice paddies, and you can't really believe your eyes. It's so big. So the example is there in Prabhupada's life, how to overcome adversity, not to become complacent, and now he's being recognized by world leaders as the Dalai Lama and Nelson Mandela and the mayor of Paris. And now we know the answer to this question that they were asking in 1977. We're currently up to 500 million books and magazines having been distributed around the world. And we see from those humble origins in 1966, a new generation, a second, third, and now fourth generation of devotees. Chant and be happy, he told us. Well, if we had only known, right, that the challenge was to undertake that monomythic hero journey to become agents of change in the larger society. Not to run away from that. And if we accept that challenge, I believe that future generations will look back at this moment and they will say that this had been a turning point in the forward progress of human civilization. Someone I know did this painting of Prabhupada looking out on the future. Thank you. That's my presentation. Thank you very much. a microphone that can go out into the audience? Yes, you may have to speak up because we don't have a microphone. Would someone like to volunteer to run this? Hold your question just for 1 second. This one's on? Yes, please. Tell me your name first. I always like to be...
Gauradas.
Haribol.
Hare Krishna Prabhu.
We're all family here, right?
Yes, you were mentioning that Srila Prabhupada didn't know how long he had to live, and you gave some examples, like from the 10th canto, where he was concerned to get out Krishna's face, etc. Yet we've heard that the pure devotee can decide at what time and when they want to leave. I think Bhishma, is one example. So I'm just trying to reconcile that. If you could shed some light.
Well, yes, the great yogis are capable of doing that. They can maintain the life force in the body and leave the body at will. And usually they wait until an auspicious moment when planets are in a certain juxtaposition, and when, by leaving through the Brahmarandra, which is this tiny point here where the 3 parts of the skull meet, they can project themselves to some heavenly realm. Prabhupada had no interest in that. He had no interest in that whatsoever. Whatever Krishna wanted was fine with him. So that idea of maintaining control is important. In the case of Grandfather Bhishma, he didn't want to die until Krishna was there and he could die seeing Krishna. That's something else. But when you're talking about the mystic yogis, they're materially motivated.
So in other words, you're saying that Srila Prabhupada didn't know when Krishna would want him to move on and for his next service, that he could leave any time.
He had been given his instructions. That's all he needed to know. That's all that he needed to know. And for as long as Krishna wanted him here, he would give his life for that purpose.
Thank you.
Havi Prabhu.
The title of this gathering, I was saying that you have honored with this presentation the name of this gathering, the Festival of Inspiration. Are you using the same explanation that you gave us, the concept of coming back after? Do you explain that in the book like that, or you just you talk about Prabhupada's life as such?
No, the book does not go into metaphors of monomythic journeys. It tells the story of Srila Prabhupada from beginning to when he passed away, and the program that I just gave you is how I would try to present Prabhupada and the philosophy and theology of Krishna consciousness, let's say in a university setting or in a yoga school setting. I left out certain things that I would explain there. For example, what is the boon? What is the knowledge that Prabhupada resurrected from oblivion and brought west? And I would go into an explanation of the soul within the body, the relationship of the soul with the Supreme Soul, and so on. I left that part out today. But the book, I hope, is an engaging work of literary non-fiction. It's told in a readable form for a non-devotee readership. And I had certain goals in writing the book. My first goal in writing it was that I wanted people reading this book to come away saying, oh, I get it, I'm not my body. The second goal I had in writing this book was for people to say, God is a person. I have to think about that. The third goal I had was for people to say, well, now I know what a real guru is. And the fourth goal I had was for them to say, I'm not just reading some book about somebody else. I'm involved in this somehow. He came from me. I'm involved in this story somehow. And the final goal was for people, the home run would be if people were to say, I think I'd like to read some of his books. Those are the purposes. Yes, in the back. Please say your name.
My name is Bhaktilata. You were saying that in general, when people come to a place where they're in a dark place and there's ordeals come by three. Do you see like three main ordeal in Prabhupada's life before he passed the threshold, or however you call it?
I didn't trace it quite that carefully. I mean, Campbell himself acknowledges that there are variations from culture to culture, and that it doesn't always fit exactly the model that he had spelled out. So I wouldn't want to reduce the immense sacrifices that Prabhupada made to three specific things. We could say, of course, leaving his family and taking sannyas, coming to America, surviving heart attacks. You can point to so many key moments in the trajectory of his hero's journey. The number three seems to work because once you don't get it, twice maybe you'll get it, 3 times you're going to get it. Yes, Prabhu.
Thank you so much for the amazing class, Prabhuji. What I found more fascinating about your class was before, when you presented about the preaching efforts of the animals, the other species of life, say the tigers, the orangutans, and we saw a picture of you as well. Could you please explain what efforts are being done on that? And it's very fascinating because it seems to me that it's kind of closer with Lord Chaitanya and the Charikana forest. So could you please explain what it is and how the wild side goes down and the other side comes up?
Okay, I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to expand it a little bit first. The question is basically, can I comment on the idea of animals, and if we relate to animals in a particular way, that there's a different kind of nature that emerges. And it reminded this Prabhu of Mahaprabhu in the, which forest was it? Jharkhand forest, dancing with the deers, and the tigers were dancing together. And there seems to have been a different level of relating between animals who otherwise would eat each other and run away from each other. So before just addressing that, let me expand it and give it some larger context. The work that we have in front of us now is moving Krishna consciousness into the larger world. There isn't an area of human endeavor where we don't have something to say. Krishna consciousness has something to say about armed conflict. Krishna consciousness has something to say about poverty. Krishna consciousness has something to say about HIV/AIDS education. Krishna consciousness has something to say about the rights of women, the rights of children. Krishna consciousness has something to say about climate change. We have an important statement to make about the issues that concern the greater part of humanity. I think we're woefully behind in the discussion about what is the language with which we can make that contribution to those various efforts in human activity. And conservationism, animal protection, etc., is one such area. We have something to say about the protection of the species because these other than human forms of life are also divine. The spark of God is within them just as much as it is within us human beings. And encroaching upon, this is Isopanishad, you encroach on others at great cost. Be prepared for an extreme reaction. Right? What is seeing the universe as the Virata Rupa, the universal form of God, if not a call to engage in conservation and environmental activity? How can we talk about developing love for God if we're destroying the world that God gave us, if we're killing the species around us? There's a spiritual imperative underlying all of these different areas. And the importance of that is that the material solutions aren't working. That's why we have a responsibility to enter into all these different areas of activity. Just by reorganizing society in a particular way does nothing. If you remember back to the early 2000s and the corporate malfeasances of Arthur Andersen and Enron and the other major corporations that led to the worst depression since the 1920s. That experience led the US government to pass a series of laws called Sarbanes-Oxley. Now, Sarbanes-Oxley, in theory, was meant to regulate the behavior of corporate officials by making them more accountable, more transparent, more regulated in their business portfolios, limiting their field of activities. It did absolutely nothing to change the criminal nature of corporate America. What it did was make a bunch of lawyers very rich because they were able to advise the corporate heads how to circumvent all of these new legislations. You cannot legislate a change of heart. That has to come from spiritual practice and knowledge. And 2008 was proof positive that nothing had changed after Sarbanes-Oxley. So the material solutions are just not working. Right? You can apply that same thinking. I'll give you an example. My particular field is war crimes law. You know, the hat that I wear is teaching about the Holocaust period and the trials of the operators of the concentration camps after the liberation in April and May of '45. And I'm invited to speak in state bar associations and continuing legal education classes. And the most enthusiastic responses to the presentation are reserved for those moments when inevitably somebody asks, what is it that we learned from the trials in Dachau and elsewhere that can inform our practice of law today? I wait for that moment because that's a chance for me to say, all right, let's get real here for a minute, okay? The law is not mechanical. The law depends on the goodwill of men and women of integrity in order to work properly. And I have to ask you this question: how do you define human life? If human life for you is nothing more than a collection of oscillating molecular balls and springs and biochemicals, and all that we are is the sum total of our actions, then let the punishment fit the crime and let's go home. If, on the other hand, you have some room in that definition of what is life, what it means to be human, for some transcendent element, call it, if you will, natural law versus positive law, then maybe, because you will recognize some inherent dignity to life, no matter how bad the crime, that will influence your feelings about how law should be practiced. Maybe we will find ourselves moving away from a punitive form of justice toward a more reformative, restorative form of justice. Maybe our feelings about capital punishment will change. Maybe our policies on drone warfare will be different. Maybe a lot of things will be different. So you see my point? We can take our philosophy, our theology, our knowledge of the self, the true definition of life, and apply it to every single area of human activity, and it'll be an absolute revolution. People have never heard this before. But that's where we have to embark on this road of trials. Every one of us in this room has some unique contribution to make to Prabhupada's movement. Whatever your particular vocation, your education, your background, your community environment, your sphere of influence, pray like anything to understand what is the contribution that you can make that will move this particular field of activity forward. That's our future. That's where we are right now. So I hope that's a long-winded answer to your question. Yes?
With your professional background, maybe slightly I'm curious, do you feel that there were war crimes conducted in Operation Iraqi Freedom? Would you care to address that? If you don't want to address that, that's fine. But now that I know your professional background, I'd be very curious to know your perspective on that.
All right, that's one of the three questions I hope no one's ever going to ask when I address it. Our invasion of Iraq, the Iraqi war. Well, I guess your question is, was there any justification? What do I think of that? Or was it a war crime? Absolutely. Short answer. One of the darkest periods in American history. Is that okay? Okay. Yes, Prabhu.
Thank you so much for the wonderful class.
But just not to make light of your question just before I listen to what you... The worst part was that it was motivated by a holier-than-thou attitude that this is God's work. That was the worst part. Because what happened was that sense of unjustified self-righteousness clouded the judgment of the entire administration. We have to be very, very, very careful. Remember, the Battle of Kurukshetra was the last gasp, not the first choice. It was the last gasp. Everything else was tried first. We unleashed a hornet's nest back then that we haven't even seen all the repercussions. Yes, Prabhu.
I like whole presentation, but especially that Star Wars, you compare how it's modern Ramayana, that is something that we can relate and people share with. One question I had, like how you came up with this title of the book is something that you, because that's the most important and one of the most important thing in the book. So it's something...
Where did the title Swami in a Strange Land come from? It comes from the Bible. Actually, in several places there's reference to I came to you like a stranger in your land. It's referring to the Messiah, but it applies to Prabhupada as well, coming to us as a savior, if you will, in a very, very strange land. So it rang true. It was also the title of a very popular science fiction book, going back, I think, to the 1960s, called Stranger in a Strange Land, which had to do with someone raised on Mars coming back to Earth. So it had a certain kind of cultural resonance as well as the biblical resonance to it. And it just seemed right that this is what he did. He came into this very strange place.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, Purva.
I wanted to thank you for your presentation. As far as your book goes, you mentioned how it would be impactful in the general community.
It's on.
Yeah. So, outside the devotee community, now how can it enrich our lives in the devotee community? Or maybe
the biography?
Yeah.
Well, I did my best to conduct in-depth research so that there would be details that we haven't read before. So there are a lot of stories that I think you will find new and revealing. There's a lot of direct dialogue. I read all of the conversations books. There's 7,000 conversation book. So many years of recorded discussions, and I read all of those. Read all of the Prabhupada letters books. Read Bhakti Vikas Swami's 3 volumes on Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, and additional research, interviewing scholars, Prabhupada's family. I was very fortunate to get Vrindaban Chandra Day's cooperation. And I think, if I may, this is my conceit, is that I brought my background in writing other biographies to invest a certain degree of readability